Caledonian Elixir. From Glasgow, Scotland, welcome to the Caledonian Elixir. I'm your host, Vincent, and you can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter X, and Facebook, and also as a podcast on Spotify. And if you haven't already, please go and hit the like, subscribe, and follow. It helps the show. So, thanks for joining us. I hope you're all well. And I think today's show is important. I know it is to me, and I'm sure you'll find it interesting because we live in perilous times with the world at a crossroads. And anyone who's a regular viewer of the show will know how concerned I am of the risk of the wars today metastasizing, escalating into something that could engulf us all. And today we have Zelensky and co. That is Mers and Macron at Downing Street. So I thought it would be a good day to bring on a guest who is very well informed and experienced in foreign affairs. So today I've got a special guest on. He is someone who witnessed war up close. He's a US Marine captain, a former State Department official who is now a voice for peace and accountability. Without further ado, Matthew Hoh. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Vincent. Thanks for having me join you.
Is your surname Ho? I didn't want to.
Yeah.
Right.
That's how you pronounce it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's
Hi,
German.
Ho.
It's German for everyone who's curious because they hear that and then they see me and they're like, "You don't look Asian," but it's a German surname. Likely was Hohl, Hohl, and then they dropped the L off for some reason or other.
As I was about to introduce you there, I thought to myself, wait, have I got his surname correct? You know? But hi, well, thanks for joining us. And you've got an amazing background story. So first of all, could you just describe your background, how you went from service as a Marine to serving in the State Department?
Right. So as you said, I was in the Marine Corps. I joined the Marine Corps before 9/11, and after I graduated from college, became an officer in the Marine Corps. Spent time in Okinawa, then went to the Pentagon, and I got put as a junior officer on the personal staff of the Secretary of the Navy. So as a junior captain, I saw things at a high level, and then I went to the Iraq War twice. Once as a DoD civilian, actually, on a State Department team, and another as a Marine Corps captain in charge of a company of Marines and sailors. And when I came back, I went into the State Department. Now you're talking about 2009. And I went to Afghanistan as a political officer with the State Department. And going to Afghanistan, seeing that the Afghan war was fundamentally no different than the Iraq War. I had my misgivings of the Iraq War. That's an understatement, suicidal because of my participation in the Iraq War. And I was holding out that somehow the Afghan War would be different. It would be the good war as it was described. And getting there in 2009, seeing that it was fundamentally no different than the Iraq War, and seeing the escalation that was taking place in 2009 by the Barack Obama administration, I resigned in protest of that escalation of that war. And for the last 15 plus years, 16 years now, I've been doing this sort of work via think tanks and other organizations, trying to bring about some degree of sanity to American foreign policy, pushing for a foreign policy that pursues peace rather than war.
So what prompted your resignation? Was it the overall strategy or lack of, or was it something that you witnessed over there serving?
No, there wasn't anything in particular that I witnessed. There are a couple things that you could count as the final straw, whether it was a young man. We had accidentally killed a teenager. The United States had shot and killed, seeing his body in front of me. Another, as well as same time occurring, the Afghan presidential elections in August of 2009 that were incredibly fraudulent, incredibly fraudulent. I was on an Afghan army base and I witnessed the Afghan soldiers stuffing the ballot boxes, so the waste of it all, right? The worthlessness of it, the corruption behind it, the racket of that war, and then the decision by the United States for purely political reasons to pursue escalation of the war rather than negotiation, settlement, and exit. The United States, the Obama administration, just like the Bush administration, decided that a military victory was best for them politically. So this was in 2009, in the midst of a massive escalation of that war. When Barack Obama comes in the office, you're talking about 70,000 American troops, NATO troops, and contractors. And by the summer of 2010, that 70,000 has grown to 240,000. So essentially, quarter million man army in Afghanistan within a year or so of Barack Obama coming into office. This decision to militarily win in Afghanistan when it was an unwinnable war. And worse, that type of escalation was just going to fuel the war. It was only going to increase support for the Taliban. It was only going to embolden and strengthen the corrupt warlords and drug lords that we have put in power and we're keeping in power in Afghanistan. So those are the things that went into my resignation, again, 16 years ago now.
Before we get to the subject of the escalating the conflicts that are waging across our world today, I'd like to ask you a question about Afghanistan, something that has personally always confounded me, and it has to do with the global drug trade market. Now, what has always been peculiar to me is in the year 2000, under the Taliban, Afghanistan's opium production was around 100 tons of opium. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But just 7 years later, under US and UK occupation, Afghanistan's opium production shot up, skyrocketed to over 8,000 tons. And those figures are from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. So, why did opium production increase massively when NATO took over in Afghanistan?
Well, essentially, what occurred when the United States enters into Afghanistan in 2001 is we put back into power the men who had been the drug lords prior to the Taliban taking power in the mid 90s. So you go back to before the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan, go back to the 1970s, and Afghanistan doesn't produce narcotics in any degree for export. They produce them, of course, for local consumption, but there's no export industry for narcotics in Afghanistan. And then you have the Soviet Union occupation, the war. You have the Pakistani, the Saudi, the American support of the Mujahideen, the reactionary religious movements in Afghanistan, the rural movements against the Soviet occupation, against the Afghan Communist government. And what the CIA and the Pakistani ISI, the Pakistani Intelligence Service, what they do in order to help fund this war against the Soviet occupation is they bring in poppy crop. They bring in poppies. They bring in essentially crops to create an opium industry, narcotics industry. This, of course, is legacy from the British Opium Wars. These crops that they bring in from Pakistan, what had once been British India, were the exact crops, or not the exact crops, but you can understand the same industry that had fed the Opium Wars and all that preceded it in terms of the British import of opium into China in the 19th century. These are the same crops, and it's the same, it's the same genesis. So what you have occurring then in the 80s is this use by the Mujahideen of poppy fields to provide revenue, right? This export of essentially raw opium, heroin, to provide funding for their war against the Soviets and against the Afghan Communist government. And so these warlords who then are taken out of power in the mid 90s by the Taliban, when the United States comes into Afghanistan in 2001, these are the men that the Americans put into power. So it's men like Muhammad Atta in the north. It's men like Gul Arga Sharzai, eventually in the east. It's men like Marshal Fahim, who became the defense minister. It's Hizbullah Akhundzada in the south. And then, the outlier in that is a man named Ahmed Wali Karzai, who is President Hamid Karzai's half brother, who was not involved in the drug trade following or during the Soviet wars of the 1990s. But when President Karzai inserts his brother or his half brother as the governor of Kandahar province, the second largest province after Kabul, the second most important place in Afghanistan after Kabul, Ahmed Wali Karzai becomes the boss of the drug trade there. And so you have this point in Afghanistan, like say in 2009 when I was there, when the largest drug dealer, the largest drug lord in Afghanistan, was the president's brother. And by extension, since Ahmed Wali Karzai was the largest drug lord in Afghanistan, that made him one of the largest drug lords in the world. And this is all going on with the understanding of the American government, except that it was lied about. And media would report on these things and then ignore it for the rest of their stories, right? So the media would have articles or reports on these types of things. I mean, you can go to the New York Times and find articles from the early parts of the American occupation of Afghanistan talking about Marshal Fahim, talking about Akhundzada in the South, talking about Ahmed Wali Karzai's involvement with, being a drug baron. But then those pieces are never put together. And it's always the narrative is kept that the Taliban are running the drug trade when the Taliban were not running the drug trade. And it's only been the last few years that the UN and other institutions have admitted that we got this wrong. We were incorrect. The Taliban would tax the drug trade to a certain extent, but they weren't running it. It was being run by the Afghan government and the Afghan military.
And before Afghanistan and the involvement of Western forces there, we saw in the 60s and 70s Laotian, Burmese, and Thai opium production in the Golden Triangle, and with individuals such as Kun Sa and the complicity of the CIA in cultivation of, opium and the poppy over there. So wherever you look, and when it comes to mass opium production, you seem to see the hand of either the United Kingdom or the United States.
Right. And the United States begins its involvement with this observing the British. So the Americans had a small role in the Opium Wars of the 1840s. What you have, though, is American families, particularly families out of New England and in the American Northeast, who make vast fortunes, what was called the China trade. One of the reasons why you want to have the conquest of California and the western coast of the continent by the United States in the 1840s, through the Mexican American War, is to have these harbors, to have these ports on the Pacific to help facilitate trade of all kinds, as you can imagine, but in particular to help facilitate this type of China trade, right? And so that legacy was always there. And the role of the American intelligence services, as you say, Vincent, very well documented in the trade throughout Southeast Asia. It has to be noted that the Americans pick up from the French. The French were heavily involved in that trade as well. And when the French leave Southeast Asia, they leave their Indochina, as they called it, and the Americans take over their role in Southeast Asia. The American intelligence services take over that association with the drug trade that the French intelligence services had with the drug trade. But you saw this before even that. The coordination between the American intelligence services, the American government, and organized crime in the Mediterranean following World War II, the relationship between drug trade criminal elements and the Americans to particularly say in southern France and then in ports of Italy to defeat the communists there. That's well established as well. Certainly,
Mhm.
the relationship between the Americans, the CIA, and drug trafficking through Central America and South America, uh, very well established. Whether it was the United States CIA bringing cocaine into the United States at the
Right.
height of the crack epidemic in the 1980s to help fund the Contras in Nicaragua. I mean, the Contras in Nicaragua, and or the relationship between the American intelligence services in, say, Colombia, Venezuela. I mean, one of the things now we see with this whole hysteria by the Trump administration about Venezuela and their demonization of the cartel of the Suns, which is essentially a made-up organization. But supposedly the two founding members of this cartel of the Suns, at least one, if not both of them, were CIA assets. They had a
Mm.
relationship with CIA. I mean, so the history of the intersection, the confluence, the relationship between the CIA in particular, but the American government through its intelligence services and organized crime, particularly drug trafficking, in order to pursue its policy aims. It's well
Mhm.
established, and as we said, took place in the Mediterranean, Central and South America, Southeast Asia, and of course, Central Asia in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and I remember a house that was involved in all that mess in the 19th century, Jardine Matheson. And when Matheson was corresponding with his partner Jardine, I remember a quote. It goes like this: "The Chinese have fallen into the snare of making them liable to the crown." And you saw what proceeded after the Chinese government tried to stop the British imperial forces from, selling opium into China. They managed to, seize Hong Kong and bombard all the coastal cities until the complete
Right,
subjugation of the Chinese government to,
right,
the the British Empire, but the amount of capital the the East India Company and the British Empire made from that, they managed to pay down so much of their debt. I think opium was the largest export of the British Crown in the early 19th century, and it's an indictment on British history. Do you think that opium was their largest export for decades? Um, but I'd like to transition this to the geopolitical quagmires that's facing us today, and in regards to the Russia-Ukraine war. And I'll be honest, I think Trump is all over the place in this one because to start off with, essentially, he supported the General Kellogg plan, which was a ceasefire first, and then just sort out the rest later. And then they had the Alaska summit, and he seemed to change his position and align closer to Russia, which is negotiations dealing with the underlying causes. A more comprehensive look at the problems causing the war. And now there's a peace document which has been revised, so this pendulum of diplomacy on Trump's part is does he have a strategy? Do you think he has a strategy to end the war, or is he just going with the wind, essentially?
I think there's a lot of things coming into play here, and I'm just as confused as you are trying to follow him, and there's no ability to predict what he's going to do in the way that maybe his predecessors could be predictive, right? I mean, Trump has no loyalty to the institutions, to the agenda, to the infrastructure of the American government or the American empire that his predecessors had. He's still an imperial president, and he still wants to see the United States empire dominate. He just
Mm,
believes in achieving it in ways different than any of his predecessors. He's not wedded to this idea that the United States has to be every place at all times, policing the world as the world's sole superpower. He sees that as inefficient. He sees it as not effective, and he doesn't believe there's a good return on investment for being involved in places around the world where, as Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, described it, you can't monetize the empire, right? I mean, so, or I think Merz said monetize the hegemony, but the same thing. So you laid out there, Vincent, that this pendulum, right, where he embraced the Kellogg plan. I mean, Keith Kellogg, retired American general, very much in line with the Ukrainians,
Mhm.
embraced by the Ukrainians, distrusted by the Russians. The Russians refused to work with him. So immediately you have this issue where Donald Trump is putting into position as his senior person for the Russia-Ukraine war, someone that the Russians won't negotiate with. And
Mhm.
that's a problem, right? As anyone can
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah.
And then you have this back and forth that goes through the first 6 months administration, where Trump is angry with the Ukrainians, he's happy with the Ukrainians. You have that really big ugly public incident between him and Zelensky in the White House, right? And then you have the United States shutting down intelligence sharing, and we're not going to give any more weapons. But then they started back up a week later. So you're exactly right. That it swung back and forth. And then you have the summit in August where Donald Trump aligns with the Russian view that there must be negotiations before there can be a ceasefire. And then you had what seemed as if a few months of nothing, where I think many
Mhm.
people, unaware it was going on behind the scenes between the Russians and the Americans, thinking that essentially that there was, you know, a, not a breakdown, but it was mired. It was stuck. And then, of course, you had this peace plan revealed in the last few weeks, or this attempt to put jumpstart negotiations. And how much is Donald Trump committed to walking away from Ukraine? I think is the estimate that everybody is trying to figure out in Moscow and Kyiv, throughout Europe, and even in Washington D.C. Uh,
Has
so
has the Trump administration suspended intel to Ukraine yet? Because over here in the UK, they were claiming he was threatening the Zelensky government that he would suspend intel unless they agreed to the 28-point peace plan, which has been revised. So, what's he actually agreeing to? The original 28 um, point document, or the revised version, and so has the Trump administration actually suspended intel to Ukraine?
No, as far as I know, they haven't. They threatened to. They gave, which was the implied threat that came with the deadline that Donald Trump initially gave. He gave the Ukrainians a very short deadline initially to respond to this plan. I think 5 days maybe, and that came and went.
Mm,
So I think that's just the way Trump is in general. Like when he negotiates, he likes to have these public statements that shows how aggressive he is, that shows how determined he is, that lets the world know what pressure he is putting on his negotiating partners. And so I think that's what you saw there. I mean, it's cliche at this point to emphasize how much Donald Trump acts like a real estate titan, but that's who he is. And so I
mm,
think this idea of how he built his own personal empire, his real estate empire, is how he conducts himself in this way. There are other aspects with Trump too. His ego is massive, and his ego
mm,
is something that I think all of us would like to just make pretend wasn't there, because we all like Vincent to talk about these things as if those we are talking about or observing are rational actors. And
mhm.
that's a mistake in general, just when we're dealing with human beings, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But in the case of Donald Trump, this idea that you're dealing with a rational actor who is going to pursue recognized national interests as opposed to his own petty personal interests just isn't there. I mean, so this idea that Donald Trump wanting to have the Nobel Peace Prize, that's something that you have to give more consideration to any other types of of interests that are involved in this. So even say the interests of the American energy companies in terms of getting their liquid natural gas into Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine, the interests of the American national security establishment in ensuring that American missiles continue to be put into Central Europe, not just the missiles that are already in Romania and Poland, but missiles being placed into Germany starting, next year, 2027, only a month away, right? I mean, those are the interests that you would think rationally the president of the United States would be using for a calculus in determining how he's going to move forward with Russia and Ukraine. But, we have to recognize that perhaps this desire for the Nobel Peace Prize trumps, forgive the pun,
Yeah.
trumps all those other considerations. Yeah. So, I mean, there's also, too, another thing that's really important here is that Donald Trump, for as much as we malign him rightfully, at times, but I think he does have a view of the world that has a strategic uh, uh, that has a strategic understanding to it. That he views the world as already being a multipolar world. Whereas
Mm.
most commentators in the US, and I believe in Europe as well, will say a multipolar world is coming. Most will not say a multipolar world is here already. And I think, in
Mm.
particular, say in Washington, D.C., that is, heresy to admit that the United States is no longer the world's hegemon, right? That we are no
Yeah.
longer the sole empire. And where his predecessors would hold on to that, right, with dead hands, with a death grip, and would never let that idea go of giving up that supremacy by the United States. Donald Trump doesn't see the world that way. And he understands the world's already in a multipolar order, and that it's only going to continue to grow in that way. And if the United States remains steadfast, holding on to this myth at this point of the U.S. as a sole superpower, then it will not just be bypassed, but will be defeated, for lack of a better term, or at least put into a great disadvantage by other powers around the world. So Trump's idea is this realignment, this consolidation, or recentering of the American empire in order to not just compete or survive, and not just to thrive in a multipolar world, but to continue to dominate. So this idea of pulling back from being overextended, making America's allies or vassals, if you will, do their share, right? I think that's this aspect of as well as abandoning parts of the world that Trump doesn't see as necessarily important strategically in the U.S. to focus on other parts. So I think the way Donald Trump would look at this, Vincent, is he would say, look, while we've been wasting our time in Europe, right? Spending all this money, having all these troops there, the bulk of our diplomatic effort and attention is on Europe. It has been. What's the return from that? What are we getting from that? Europe is completely deindustrialized. We don't have what is the benefit to us? What resources can we extract from Europe? And then he looks at the Western Hemisphere, at South America, Central America, and he says the Chinese are the major trading partners in most of these countries now. This is our hemisphere. What happened? Right. So Trump's desire to have clear spheres of influence from which the United States can benefit from. I think that's something that shapes his policies. And when you see that, you can kind of see how he has he can have that take it or leave it approach to Russia and Ukraine. That's stymied, of course, by Trump's own personality, his ego, how fickle he can be. You can't explain. He had a few weeks ago this emphasis on Nigeria, that the United States would start military action in Nigeria. Yeah,
Mm.
that doesn't fit into anything I just described, except for maybe trying to ensure control of resources in Africa. But that would not be the way to go about that. So there are all types of things because it's Donald Trump and just the reality of the government he's in charge of being insipid and crackpot at times, or not at times, but mostly, that upset this. And as well, too, those he put around him. Certainly a guy like Keith Kellogg would not support this vision not just for Russia-Ukraine relations, but in terms of general American strategy around the world. And then you have others too. You have those like Marco Rubio, who's a neoconservative. So the idea of giving up in Europe is something that just goes against what he believes in.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah,
and if you look at the last two figures who were sent to Moscow, Witkoff, and Kushner, their outlook on how to see a conclusion to the war, couldn't be, you know, it couldn't be any more different, when you compare it to Kellogg or Rubio,
right, right, and that's why they're there. And this idea that Trump is utilizing his friend, another billionaire real estate guy, Steve Witkoff, and his son-in-law, uh, also a real estate guy, but more importantly, son-in-law, because without the apparatus of the American government, that's one of the complaints you hear about Witkoff is that he doesn't have a staff. He doesn't even have his own interpreter. He goes these places and he uses the other guy's interpreters, or
Mm,
translators. I mean it's not like Steve Witkoff or Jared Kushner have offices or titles, other than I'm sure they have some type of they use the American government planes and things like that. But you can't go to the State Department.
that guy must be overworked. One day he's over in Israel, then he's in Iran, and then he's in Russia, and then he's back in the US,
I know. It's a lot of these guys, and I would say the same thing even for a guy like Tony Blinken. Hillary Clinton supposedly set the record for the amount of miles she traveled as Secretary of State. And I had a friend who worked for both Rice and Clinton on their personal staffs. She traveled with them, and these people generally have a stamina that is incredible. A
Mhm.
stamina that separates them from others.
Yeah.
Did put. So I think Witkoff is like one of those. Even a Donald Trump. I mean, like the fact that he's 79 years old and you see how much he travels, you see how much he does, and people are taking it out on him and falling asleep in cabinet meetings and stuff. But the stamina of these
That's
individuals to
impressive, yeah.
do this type of work with the travel and what anyone who's traveled knows the toll it takes on your body. So you're exactly right, Vincent. I mean, the fact that you have to worry then for someone who travels that much at their age, how's that affecting their decision making? How's that affecting their cognitive
Mhm.
ability?
Yeah, yeah. Do you know, my take on this is partly affected, you were, alluding to how we're all human, and because of that, we're all flawed, and we've all got our own, perceptions and interpretations of history and of current events. And, I'm myself included in that. So when I look at this conflict, I'm really concerned about number one, my own national security interest, and I don't think our national security is helped by being at war with Russia or having a bad relationship with Russia. Also, I grew up with films such as films like The Day After,
Yeah.
that that freaked me out, and being told stories by my about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if I could, I would just like to play a clip that was sketched in my memory, even though it's a film, right? It's just from a film, but it was so powerful and frightening to me that when I hear people like Boris Johnson, and his sister, and his cadre calling for British boots on the ground, I feel like where were they in the Cold War when it
Hmm.
was understood that a direct conflict between NATO and the Soviet Union, Russia, must never happen. So I would like to just play this clip and see what you think.
What's going on?
Those are Minuteman missiles.
Like a test, sort of. Like a warning?
They're on their way to Russia. They take about 30 minutes to reach their target.
So do theirs, right?
Missile warning, this is Beale. Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high. Roger, we've got 32 targets in track and 10 impacting points. I want to confirm, is this an exercise? Roger, copy. This is not an exercise.
Roger, understand. Major Reinhardt, we have a massive attack against the U.S. at this time.
Hey! Oh, come on, baby. Don't die on me now. Oh.
I was lagging a bit on that end, but did that play okay?
Yeah, it did. It played well. It played well.
Yeah, that's a scene from the movie The Day After, which, you know, it depicts a very frightening scene. And as I said, I've spoken to a lot of journalists over here regarding this conflict, and they stick to their ground that something like that will never happen.
Yeah.
The Russians will never use nuclear weapons. However, our side, the Allies, used nuclear weapons and vaporized hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in a flash. So, if our side will use them under certain circumstances, then why is it impossible that the Russians will, you know, they'll never use them? I don't get that. And so, do you think there's a scenario where the Russians would ever resort to using nuclear weapons?
Oh, I think so. I think they've made it clear that they would. They adjusted their doctrine, their policies in the last couple of years to give them more flexibility in their use. Neither the United States or Russia have a no first use policy. The Chinese do, you know, and both sides have been clear in their statements over the last decade or two about having usable nuclear weapons. I mean, you saw us, particularly in the U.S., in the second half of the Barack Obama administration, as as the American modernization program, which began at less than $1 trillion and is now well over $2 trillion in terms of modernizing America's nuclear weapons. You know, this concept of having usable nuclear weapons. The Russians similarly have invested in and greatly expanded their nuclear capabilities over the last 20 years. This comes, of course, as a result of a number of things, but most especially the George W. Bush administration's abrogation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2001. But, you know, the idea that we wouldn't use them is, as you said, we already have used them. What do you mean we wouldn't use them? And right? I mean, and you could see, whether it's historically, the fact that both sides during the Cold War had plans to use them. when you talk to people who do the war games that are involved, whether it was during the Cold War or war games presently, whether it's a war game against China or against Russia, nuclear weapons very often come about. And oftentimes it's our side, Vincent, that uses them first because we are at a disadvantage. We're losing. So we use a nuclear weapon in an attempt to what's called escalate to de-escalate. And, how well do you think that works? Right.
Yeah.
I mean, again, knowing everything we know about human nature and whatnot. So the fact that we have used them, they were in the plans to be used during the Cold War by both sides. Both sides talk about having usable nuclear weapons, and the policies are in place to allow them to be utilized. Plus, the war games show that these weapons are utilized in war games. And what more evidence do you need to come to the conclusion that these things are very dangerous to possess, because there's a great and high likelihood that they would be utilized.
Yeah, yeah. And I spoke to Boris Johnson's sister, Rachel Johnson, and I had this conversation with her, and she said, "Look, nuclear weapons will never be used in war." I was like, "Rachel, they already have been used in war. Did you forget about the Second World War?" She made that statement, "Nuclear weapons will never be used in war." I'm like, Rachel, come on. And you see Donald Trump, President Trump flirting with the idea of providing Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles. And I was, referring to that pendulum of diplomacy, but you've got that pendulum there in terms of, what kind of weaponry to send. And to me, that couldn't be any more foolish to think that when you look back a little bit in history in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we almost had a situation that the United States would strike Russia or the Soviet Union if they didn't remove missiles from Cuba. Now, not only do missiles, Western missiles exist now on the territory of Ukraine, but they are being fired from Ukraine into Russia with the support of British special forces, probably American special forces.
Mhm.
And as Ukraine doesn't have the space-based infrastructure to navigate and target those, locations in Russia, we're culpable. We're involved. And when I hear politicians such as Starmer argue for tomahawks to be sent to Ukraine to be used against sites in Russia, I'm just blown away, you know?
Yeah, it is. It's this idea that somehow if we escalate far enough, that the other side will back down. Again,
Mhm.
it's type of escalate to de-escalate madness, and it just doesn't work. I mean, it just people look back and where do you see such things giving you the certainty to think that that policy is going to work? Let alone the fact that this, just in particular, this war in Ukraine for almost 4 years now, we've been told that if we just give the Ukrainians this weapon, this kit,
Mhm.
this technology, then that will defeat the Russians. And, it's just always one more thing comes up. If it's not the Javelins, then it's the HIMARS. If it's not the HIMARS, then it's the Abrams tanks. If it's not the Abrams tanks, it's the
Mhm.
F-16s. Then it's the ATACMS missiles. And now, of course, the next thing is it's the Tomahawks. And if we gave them the Tomahawks, which there are all kinds of problems just practically doing so in terms of the ground launchers for the Ukrainians to fire them. We just really don't have. But say that wasn't an issue. Well, 3 months, 6 months, a year later, when they've proved to be ineffective in causing Russia to surrender, it's going to be something next. It'll
Yeah.
now it will be the Prism missile, or it will be trying to get them some early version of the hypersonics, like the Gray Eagle or whatever that thing is that the United States wants to introduce next year. I mean, so it's always going to be something as you climb up this escalation ladder. And if there's not a break, then the only way you go is up. That's the thing about that why that phrase, that term, that image, the escalation ladder is so effective, because it
Mhm.
really properly does depict how things like this occur. It's you either go up a ladder or down a ladder. There's no side to side, right? You can stay standing on it for a while, but at some point you have to go up or go down. and that's what we're seeing here. So yeah, I mean, this madness of giving the Ukrainians tomahawks, that discussion came out at the same time that the United States purposely leaked to the Financial Times and to the Wall Street Journal. This is back October, maybe beginning of November, where the United States made it clear to the world that we were the ones giving the Ukrainians the intelligence for the Ukrainians to attack Russian energy infrastructure, particularly gas refineries. The United States made it clear for the world, by leaking it to, again, FT and to Wall Street Journal, that we're the ones doing this. I mean, so as you rightly depicted it, Vincent, this back and forth, with carrots and sticks, if you will. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, to try and get the Ukrainians to the peace table as well as with the Russians.
So don't forget, just a couple of months ago, we had Operation Spiderweb, where there was that drone attack on Russia's nuclear bomber wing. I mean, imagine something like that happened over here. We would never hear the end of it.
Right.
But I would like to play one more clip. It's very short. It's only like 20 seconds. But the reason that I downloaded this clip is actually due to what I heard earlier on it was a media outlet here where they were saying that the West has no intention of trying to take apart Russia. They're not trying to annex Russia or take it apart. Now, here's an interesting video of Kaja Kallas, and she's calling for Russia to be broken apart.
Russia's defeat is not a bad thing, because then there could be really a change in the society, and there are many different nations right now part of Russia as well. I think if you would have more like small nations, it's not a bad thing if the big power is actually much smaller.
So, we got to make Russia much smaller and make it into a collection of small nations, without, one very powerful centralized government based in Moscow. Imagine we did that in the UK. Imagine we did that in France or Germany or the United States. What would that mean?
Right.
What is she calling for there?
Oh, she's calling for a policy that you've seen throughout, whether it's British or American foreign policy as empires, to radically destabilize your opponents by breaking them apart. I mean, this is a policy that Israel and the Americans pursue throughout the Middle East. The idea that we don't want one central government in Syria. We want multiple cantons, right? Balkanize Syria so that there can be no effective resistance against Israeli policy in the region or American policy in the region. I mean, the idea of making your neighbors, if you can't control them, if you can't own them, making them unstable, making them chaotic, making them at war within themselves. Well, that's the second best thing, right? And so I think that's the way that has this idea with Russia, is to break it into a dozen or 24 or 100 different pieces, so that they'll fight amongst themselves. So if we can't have Russia, nobody can. That's the idea behind it. That's the pettiness, the arrogance, the tyranny that comes, or the entitlement that comes from this type of imperial thinking. And do you know when that clip was? Was that a more recent clip of her saying that?
So be honest, I don't know when it was.
I remember this was a big thing that that was being said in Western circles, roughly 4 years ago, when Russia launched its invasion and this war began, or the continuation, because the war really begins in 2014, et cetera. But this is something you hear among American and European commentators: this opportunity to defeat Russia and break it apart. That Russia is really just an empire with all these colonies, and we need to, et cetera, et cetera. And it's madness. And you could also see the brutal nature of these people, right? When Kaja Kallas is saying these types of things, it's the same spirit, it's the same mentality, it's the same degree of antipathy towards fellow human beings as they possess with the Ukraine war. This idea that we're going to let Ukraine bleed itself out, that Ukraine is going to sacrifice millions of lives in terms of killed, wounded, people being displaced, made refugees, right? We're going to ruin Ukraine for our purposes. And this idea, too, of like, we'd rather see Russia torn apart into a multitude of civil wars and instability and for their people to suffer than to have the current government in power in Russia. I mean, you see the cruelty of these people, their greed, their selfishness, and just how strong their righteousness is, that they feel that the best thing is to cause harm to others for the achievement of their own self-interest. And again, whether it's in Ukraine, where the cost on the battlefield and the cost to Ukrainian society has been enormous, or it's this idea of we should break Russia apart, cause mass chaos, mass suffering, mass disruption, civil war, rather than allow the government to remain in place.
Do you know? I think Kaja Kallas is also. I think she's from the Baltic states,
Mhm.
and that would be one reason why she is so hostile towards Russia, because as you know, the Baltic states and Russia don't. They've got a blood feud essentially. Historically, they've been fighting for centuries. So it makes sense that a politician, a diplomat from the Baltic states, would have a very belligerent, hostile,
Yep.
perspective on in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But
Yeah,
transition.
Vincent, with that, like, yeah, I understand that. I certainly don't begrudge the Baltics people for how they feel towards Russia. Well, I get it,
Mm,
but she's
mhm,
also the EU foreign minister, right?
yeah.
This is not an individual in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia who has a generational history of
Mhm.
subjugation by the Russians, who has these legitimate grievances or feelings towards the Russians. But Kaya Kallas is a she's the EU foreign minister or foreign secretary, and I think she, you would like to see someone in that position rise above, base nationalist feelings.
Yeah, yeah, you would. But, history shows that, you just kinda get, a repeat of it. You could go back into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and how they were fighting with Russia centuries ago, and again, today, it's just that blood feud continues, and now she's in a very powerful position in the European Union, and she seems to be advocating for more conflict, and it's not good. Um, you know you're from the United States, and in the 2024 election, I supported, um, Trump, because I liked what he was saying about ending the regime change wars, for example.
Mhm.
And when I watched that assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, and you saw him get right back up, and the blood trickling down his
Right.
face, and the American flag billowing in the background. That was a very powerful, iconic move and image, and I knew straight away he was going to win. Right, after that, if he didn't, back off and step down and allow Vance or someone else, I was like, he has that thing wrapped up. He's going to win this. And as I said, he was saying some good things about ending the regime change wars. But now we see a naval build-up in just off the coast of Venezuela, and a lot of interesting political figures in the United States, such as Lindsey Graham, calling for Maduro to step down. So is Trump about to break his promise and start a regime change operation in Venezuela?
It certainly seems that way, Vincent. It certainly, you look at it and you say, how could he back down now? Not because of the cost of putting all those ships there and everything else, but just because of the statements they've made. How could they back down now?
Mhm.
So I think for no other reason than that, and all the converging interests as to why regime change appeals to so many in Washington, D.C., whether it's the oil, whether it's the latent anti-socialist, anti-communist feelings, it's the people like Marco Rubio who are obsessed with Latin America and U.S. control of it, whether it's reasons of like we were saying before about realigning or recentering the American empire to focus on the Western Hemisphere. Just today I read this morning that the United States Army just created a new command called Western Hemisphere Command. They shut down their North Command, their South Command, their Forces Command, and put them all together into a Western Hemisphere Command. So you can see the U.S. military adapting to that strategy, to that vision of the world, or how the American empire should be ordered. So you have all these different reasons as to why regime change seems so appealing to so many in Washington, D.C. And up against the reality of what Venezuela is like, its size, it's twice the size of Iraq. You're not going to see an American invasion like Iraq. I think this would be much more like Libya. Where it's American air power being used along with special operations forces and cyber attacks and other things in order to try and give the support needed to those who oppose Maduro to overthrow the government. Whether or not they actually have that ability, they can coalesce and create the force needed to eject Maduro from power. Who knows? But again, just like Kaya Kalas, not really caring too much about the lives of Ukrainians or Russians, no one in Washington, D.C. is lying awake at night worrying about the well-being of the 30 million people of Venezuela and what would happen if such a regime change war was to begin.
Why is there that intent from the Trump administration to do a regime change operation? Because I remember in his first term, he was calling for Maduro to go, and wasn't there an assassination attempt?
During his first administration?
Yeah.
Yeah, there were. Yeah, there was, and there was there've been since 2005, since 2002, there's been 5 coup attempts that we know of against the Venezuelan government by the American government, and there's been 12 or 13 or 14 round of sanctions. John Bolton, who was Donald Trump's second national security advisor, Michael Flynn didn't last very long. But John Bolton, who people familiar with him, neoconservative, very much a representative of traditional American foreign policy establishment, traditional American imperial thinking. He was the proponent of regime change in the first Trump administration, along with some others. But then he got on the outs with Donald Trump and left the administration, and that may have precluded that drive in the first Trump administration to conduct regime change or try and conduct regime change in Venezuela. Now with Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Rubio, who's been obsessed with this, the only thing he's more obsessed with is Cuba, this idea of carrying out regime change in Venezuela is the priority of the American Secretary of State, as well. He's also the national security advisor. The last time you had someone in the U.S. government who was both national security advisor and Secretary of State, you're talking to Henry Kissinger under Richard Nixon. The other factor in this too is how much Venezuela and overall Latin American policy play into American domestic policy. So if you can imagine Marco Rubio whispering into the ear of Donald Trump about why we need to carry out this regime change in Venezuela, on the other side, the Homeland Security Advisor, Stephen Miller, who's the architect of the immigration raids that are occurring throughout the United States, the buildup of immigration customs and enforcement, the mass deportations, et cetera. Miller is arguing to Donald Trump that these types of actions in Latin America are necessary or integral to the success of America's domestic policies, because you can't just have this anti-immigration effort here in the U.S. You have to battle it where these people come from, right? This idea, we don't fight them there, we have to fight them here. And so you could see how Donald Trump, in both ears, he's got Rubio making a neocon imperialist argument for regime change in Venezuela, and Stephen Miller and the other making an argument that these types of things are integral to our success here in our domestic policies.
Is Venezuela a country that is pushing a lot of drug traffic towards the United States, or immigration towards the United States?
Immigration, yes. Immigration, yes, because of a number of things, but most importantly, because of the American sanctions that have just absolutely devastated the Venezuelan economy. So you have seen a lot of Venezuelan migrants in the last 20 years, in particular, the last 10 years, coming to the United States. Many of them received what was called temporary protected status by particularly the Biden administration. They were viewed as political refugees. They were they represented the fruits of American policy in Venezuela. So in the way that other immigrants, migrants, refugees would not be accepted, they were, because this was favorable to American policy to demonstrate, how these people were fleeing the cruel dictator in Venezuela who's mismanaging the economy, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is that the American sanctions have the greatest impact on all of this. The flow of drugs, though, into the United States does not come through Venezuela. I mean, certainly some must, but in terms of maybe cocaine, it does. But in terms of the fentanyl, the things that are killing over 100,000 Americans a year through overdoses, that does not come through Venezuela. That comes through Mexico. That comes in through airliners. That comes in by boat to some degree through the Pacific. But we know that the biggest traffickers of drugs into the United States are American citizens. We also know the role that, say, the Mexican cartels play in all this, where they are the dominant factor. The long role that Colombia has had, the role that Ecuador has, Peru, all of these orders of magnitude above what Venezuela entails or provides in terms of the drug trade that comes into the United States. The whole thing is rather farcical if you lay it out on paper, and just exposes how vapid and superficial and just what a lie it all is. This casus belli for war in Venezuela, it's just simply not true. If it was the case, then we should be attacking Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, different countries throughout Central America well before we attack Venezuela.
So you think this is caused, therefore, or correct me if I'm wrong, if I've understood you wrong, but you think it's caused by Rubio essentially whispering in Trump's ear, telling Trump, giving him bad information about Venezuela, that this build-up of naval assets to attack or threaten to attack Venezuela is because of individuals like Rubio and Miller?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly that's what's unique to this administration, right? Are these ideologues, right, who have this obsession with Latin America. But there's also an inertia with regards to Venezuela that Trump has inherited. So, I mean, this goes back to the George W. Bush administration. Again, the United States tries to first time we tried to overthrow Hugo Chavez, who comes to power in 1999, is in 2002. And this has got to do with oil interests. This has got to do with other interests through Venezuela, because Venezuela has other commodities as well, other resources as well. But also, too, the idea that Chavez government and now the Maduro government are socialist governments, although, they're really hybrid from what I understand about them. They're not. But the idea that you just can't have that on the American hemisphere, the idea that they are autonomous, they're independent of American control. So you have an empire that right in its back door, you have these countries, whether it be Cuba, whether it be Nicaragua, whether it be Venezuela, thumbing their nose at the American empire. And that just can't be allowed. Right. So you've had a number of interests that really that really are part of an American imperial agenda, that you can understand why this is now the fourth presidency to be interested in removing Maduro from power, because it benefits so many, again, whether it's the oil industry, whether it's just the ideologues, et cetera. And then what makes us unique, as we were just saying, is that you have a Rubio, and a Miller, men who were obsessed with Latin America, obsessed with Latinos, at the top of the hierarchy now.
Where does that obsession come from? Why is Rubio obsessed with Cuba and Venezuela?
Well, Rubio's parents fled. Yeah, Rubio's parents fled Cuba, not under Fidel Castro, but under the dictator Batista. So the America's dictator in Cuba, who, if people aren't familiar, was cruel and terrible and just absolutely horrendous. But he was our guy in Havana, as they say. And so, but Rubio's parents fled under Batista, but they also then became very much involved with the Cuban refugee communities all throughout Florida, which dominate Florida, the state of Florida in its society. It dominates Florida's economy, and it dominates Florida's politics. And that's the milieu, that's the ecosystem, that's the environment that Rubio grew up with. I mean, and so he's a creature of this, not just, again, not hostility. I think obsession is a better word, particularly anti-Castro, anti-Cuba sentiment. But that extends then to others in the region. Nicaragua, say this, so that comes out of the Cold War. That comes out of any good acolyte or follower of Ronald Reagan would have ready to go to war against Nicaragua because that's a communist foothold in Central America. And if we don't stop the commies there, next thing you know, they're going to take Guatemala, and then they're going to take Mexico, and then we'll have to be fighting them in Texas and Arizona. I mean, those are the arguments I heard in the 80s as a kid about American policy in Central America, particularly with regard to Nicaragua. Rubio grows up with that. That's imbued in him as well. That's tied very tightly to the anti-Castro, anti-Cuba communities or Cuban refugee communities throughout Florida. And then Venezuela, coming around in 1999 with Chavez coming to power. That's just in the front. That's just an insult that the United States can't take. That's an independence and autonomy, a departure from American hegemony that just can't be allowed. So again, all these things combine into someone like with Rubio. So whether it's his parents' story, whether it's growing up in Florida in those conditions, or whether it's just his view as a neoconservative, it makes it paramount to him as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor that something is done about Venezuela.
Mm. Yeah, we don't, over here in the UK, we don't get much coverage in terms of what's going on in Venezuela and the conflict between the United States and Venezuela. It's just in a very general way, a very general sense. So it's always good to get better information as to what's going on over there and the causes behind it, especially if there is going to be a conflict that breaks out between the US and the Venezuelan government. Matthew Hoh, it's been an honour having you on, and if you would like to promote anything or tell the audience about anything.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. I've enjoyed it. I appreciate you having me on. My Twitter or my X account is Matthew P. Hoh, P as in Patrick, last name spelled H-O-H. And I'm on Substack at, Matthew Hoh on Substack or whatever. And then my organization is the Eisenhower Media Network. That's who I work with. And please follow Eisenhower Media Network and check out what they do. And, one last thing I just want to say, you played that clip of the day after, and you said it had a big impact on me. It had a big impact on you. Excuse me. That had a big impact on me too. When I was 10, that movie scared the hell out of me. That really frightened me. And so this is, we were talking before, just now about Rubio and what he grew up with. I think it's the impacts that we have in childhood that can have these long-term effects on us in terms of, how we as adults want to see the world. And so Rubio certainly growing up in an environment where the world would only be set right by the restoration of justice, if you will, in Cuba, or the elimination of communism throughout Central and South America. I think for you and I, we grew up and we were through various experiences understood that, there's madness in thinking like that. And that what comes from following those types of beliefs are what we were shown would happen through a film like The Day After.
Yeah, I think Viktor Frankl said something like, Auschwitz taught us what man is capable of, and Hiroshima, what is at stake.
Right.
And we know when we have camps like Dachau and Auschwitz that human beings are very much capable of doing the insane. And when you look at Hiroshima, we know that nuclear weapons can be used too, and we were talking about that imprint
Right.
on our consciousness when we grow up seeing films like The Day After. It does concern me when I think about that blood feud, that historical blood feud that exists between so many European nations, but now they are in that network, that alliance of NATO, that if one is attacked, then we're all going to get pulled in. And I
Right.
firmly believe there are senior politicians in NATO that are all on board in terms of having a war with Russia.
Right.
And that does frighten me. So
Right.
I hope
Right.
that wiser heads, prevail.
Yeah, there's a one last thing. There's that film on Netflix, House of Dynamite, which is about a single missile being launched at the United States in the decision process. But at the end, there's a scene with the American general who's in charge of all our missile forces, American nuclear forces, and that type of worldview of
Mhm.
this willingness to pursue war. Because it would be, because he's a crackpot realist, as C. Wright Mills called these types of people. I think just that scene alone is worthwhile, just because how frightening it is that there really are people like that. So whether it's this character in the film, or whether it's like the people in real life that you're talking about who be willing to go to war for what, they exist. They really do exist.
Mhm. Well, again, Matthew, it was good having you on. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. Me too.
Yeah, right. And if I could have you back on again in the future, if something does happen between the United States and Venezuela, that'd be good, because again, there's not a lot of informed voices over here that would
Yeah.
have that discussion.
Yeah, happy to.
Okay.
Anytime.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
And that was Matthew Hoh, and it was a really informative conversation, discussion, I think. Next week, we're going in a different direction. I have an exorcist and paranormal investigator on to discuss their experience, their history with the paranormal. So if you're interested in that, tune in next week. And if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to like, share, and follow. And you can donate at buymeacoffee.com/Caledonian Elixir. But until next week, thanks for tuning in.
Gold pressed platinum, slip strips and bars. If you ever find some, you can lose it in quartz. Get a Ractagino, spin the double wheel. Order a black hole, just depends how you feel. Yeah, it just depends how you feel. Gold pressed platinum, you know it's a gas. Mom vomits it up into a tiny little glass.